When a billionaire's daughter marries a janitor on a reckless bet, she thinks it's all just a game, but as she steps into his world, she sees something she never expected: genuine love, real sacrifice, and just when she starts to fall for him, the truth threatens to destroy everything. Will he ever forgive her, or will this betrayal cost her more than she ever imagined? Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if you believe in second chances, be sure to like and subscribe for more. Victoria Sinclair didn't believe in consequences. When your father owned half the city and your last name could open any door with a whisper, rules weren't something you followed, they were something you paid to disappear. The Gaia was overflowing with old money, scandals, and the type of people who measured success in private jets and offshore accounts. Victoria had been coming to these galas since she could walk, and now at 24 they all blurred together: the same faces, the same fake laughter, the same intoxicating emptiness. She swirled the champagne in her glass. She was bored all night until Kendall Hastings sat down next to her with a smirk that said, "Trouble girl, you look miserable." Kendall thought as she took an olive from her martini and popped it between her teeth. Victoria sighed, "Because I guess you've already slept with half the room, and the other half are either married or boring." Victoria turned her head a little and smiled at Kendall. Kendall was right, all of these men were boring. The same polished, predictable, desperate to impress her with their wealth, as if she didn't already own everything they had. They showered her with gifts, extravagant trips, and empty words. None of it interested her anymore. "I need a challenge," Victoria muttered. Kendall's expression sharpened. "Well, I might have something fun for you." Victoria glanced at her, mildly intrigued. "Go on." Kendall leaned in, voice low. "Teasing? You claim love is just a business arrangement, that men are disposable. Prove it." Victoria arched a brow. "And how exactly do I do that?" Kendall smirked. "Marry someone beneath you and nobody, and prove that love, real love, doesn't exist." Victoria's lips parted slightly, but Kendall wasn't done. "Pick a man who has nothing, make him fall for you, let him think he's won the jackpot, then pull the rug out from under him. Show him that love is just a fantasy for the poor." Victoria's gaze flickered with something between amusement and curiosity. It was reckless, cruel, and exactly the kind of entertainment she was looking for. "What's in it for me?" she asked, faking disinterest. Kendall shrugged. "Other than proving you're untouchable, let's say if you do it, I'll hand over that penthouse in Milan." Victoria's interest peaked. The penthouse was a coveted piece of real estate, something Kendall had never let anyone set foot in. It wasn't about the prize, though, it was about winning. Victoria downed the rest of her champagne and smirked. "Get that penthouse ready." "Ready." Kendall grinned. "We'll see about that. Now let's find your victim." Victoria scanned the room, unimpressed. "A trust fund baby in a tailored suit too. Easy, a wannabe tech mogul with a six-figure watch. Predictable." Then her gaze landed on someone who didn't belong. A man stood near the bar, dressed in plain black slacks and a work shirt, his sleeves rolled up, forearms dusted with cleaning residue. His posture was rigid but unbothered, his attention fixed on the crystal glass he was wiping. "The hotel janitor." Victoria tilted her head, intrigued. He wasn't just ignoring the extravagance around him, he looked like he couldn't care less. She leaned toward Kendall. "Who's that?" Kendall followed her gaze and laughed. "Oh, that's new. You want the help now?" Victoria ignored her, already making her way across the room. Liam Carter noticed her approach but didn't react. Most men, especially ones with nothing, would have straightened their posture. Forced a smile, stumbled over a greeting. Liam just kept polishing the glass. Victoria stopped in front of him, tilting her head. "You're not having much fun." His grip tightened slightly on the cloth. "Didn't come here to have fun." She let out a soft hum. "Then why are you here?" "Because I work here," he said simply, setting the glass down. His voice was low, steady, uninterested. Victoria was used to men fawning over her, tripping over themselves to impress her. Liam hadn't even looked at her properly. She placed a manicured hand on the bar, leaning forward slightly, and Victoria, his gaze flicked to her for exactly half a second before he turned to grab another glass. "I know," he said, unfazed. Victoria blinked. "That was me. You know who I am?" She pressed. He exhaled through his nose. "You and your friend come here every year." "You're not exactly." Hard to miss the dismissiveness in his tone irked her. She leaned in slightly. "And yet you haven't tried to impress me." Finally Liam met her gaze. His eyes were a deep, unwavering brown, steady, unreadable. His lip quirked slightly. "Why would I?" Victoria wasn't sure if she was insulted or intrigued. This was supposed to be easy. Men like him were supposed to be grateful for attention from someone like her, yet Liam looked at her like she was no different Then the chandelier's expensive, decorative, and utterly irrelevant to his life. Victoria smiled. Slow and deliberate, she'd just found her challenge returning to Kendall. Victoria slid into her seat and crossed her legs, eyes still locked on Liam. Kendall followed her gaze, then let out a sharp laugh. "You're serious?" Victoria smirked. "I don't lose bets." Kendall sipped her drink, amused. "Oh, this is going to be fun to watch." Victoria had no doubt, and by the time she was done, Liam Carter would be completely hers. Victoria had always been good at getting what she wanted. She didn't beg, she didn't chase, and she certainly didn't lose, but Liam Carter had become a challenge she hadn't anticipated. 2 weeks had passed since the gala, and while most men in his position would have jumped at the attention of a Sinclair, Liam barely acknowledged her presence. It irritated her. No, it infuriated her. She wasn't used to being ignored, and she wasn't about to start now, so she changed her strategy. Instead of trying to force his attention, she let herself linger just long enough to be noticed. She made their interactions appear coincidental, running into him at the bar during his shift, dropping casual comments about how exhausting high society events were, feigning interest in his work. She studied him, learning what made him tick, what brought that small, almost imperceptible smirk to his lips. She asked just the right questions, ones that let him believe she was different from the rest of the entitled elite. At first, Liam kept his distance, wary of her sudden interest, but Victoria was patient, persistent in a way that never felt forced. She listened when he talked about his dream of opening a business one day, about how books had been his escape from a difficult childhood. She even pretended to share his love for classic literature, claiming she admired authors like Steinbeck and Hemingway despite never having touched their works. And just like that, the walls he'd built so carefully began to weaken as Liam started warming up. Victoria pushed the relationship forward at an accelerated pace. She became someone who understood him, who saw him for more than his circumstances. She constructed a version of herself that fit perfectly into the life he wished he She had been open about her problems with money and how tiring it was to be stuck in a world that never felt real. But Victoria loved her privileged life, and Liam needed to believe she hated it. One night, as they sat outside the hotel and watched the city lights flicker, she let out a soft sigh that was just loud enough for him to hear. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice low and careful. Victoria hesitated and looked at him as if she wasn't sure whether to speak. "A calculated move. It's just I've never met someone like you before," she murmured. "Someone real." Liam studied her, searching for deception, but she kept her expression open, genuine. She knew when to look vulnerable, when to tilt her head just slightly, when to let her voice falter, and then she said the words she knew would pull him in completely. "I think I'm falling for you." Liam froze. He hadn't expected it. He had spent weeks convincing himself that whatever this was, it was nothing more than a passing interest, but now here she was looking at him with an expression that made him feel like the most important man in the world. "Victoria," he started, uncertainty flickering across his face, "I don't know if this is a good idea." She didn't push. Instead, she let a trace of sadness enter her eyes. "Because people like me don't stay." Liam exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck. "Something like that." Victoria leaned in, slightly lowering her voice. "What if I do?" It was the moment he broke the exact fact. Second, Liam Carter let his guard down. From that point on, he was hers, and now that she had him, she needed to make sure he stayed. It didn't take long for her to introduce the idea of marriage. She knew he would hesitate, that he would be wary of something so sudden, but she also knew exactly what to say to tip him over the edge. "If you love me," she whispered one night, her fingers grazing his why. Wait. Liam stiffened. "Marriage isn't something to rush into." Victoria nodded, feigning understanding, but there was a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. One she knew he would catch. "I get it. You don't think I'm serious. You think I'll just change my mind and leave just like everyone else?" Liam sighed, frustrated. "It's not about that, isn't it?" she challenged. Silence stretched between them, tense, uncertain. Liam looked at her, then away, then back again. He was thinking, weighing the risks, trying to find a reason to say no, but in the end he had no argument against the woman who had made him believe she loved him. "Okay," he finally said. Victoria smiled as she kissed him. Victorious. 3 days later they eloped. There were no grand celebrations, no family in attendance. Just a courthouse, a judge, and a quiet exchange of vows. Liam slipped a simple silver band onto her finger, believing this was the beginning of something real. Victoria, she was already celebrating her win. She had done it. The BT was as good as won, but then something unexpected happened. Liam made her feel loved, not the kind of love she was used to, the transactional, conditional kind that existed in her world. This was different. There was no agenda, no calculated moves. Liam held her like she was fragile. Like she meant something. He spoke to her as if she was more than just a name, more than a prize. She had never questioned her games before, had never once second-guessed the things she did, but this wasn't just a game anymore. Liam wasn't supposed to feel real, and yet somehow he did. Do you think Victoria was truly moved by Liam's sincerity, or is this just another facade? Let us know in the comments. And when Liam finds out about the BT, will it break him or change everything? Hit like and keep watching to see how it all unfolds. Victoria hadn't expected marriage to be this suffocating. The first few days were manageable, charming, even she played her role well, smiling in the mirror at her reflection as Liam wrapped his arms around her, pressing a kiss to her temple. She cooked for him, listened to him talk about his job, asked questions about the books he read. She let herself be adored. It was an easy act at first, but then weeks passed. The novelty of their tiny apartment, the second-hand furniture, the modest meals, everything she once played along with began to suffocate her. The space was too small, the ceilings too low. She was used to penthouse suites and silk sheets, not thrift store blankets and flickering kitchen lights. Still, she kept up the charade. She had to. The bet wasn't over yet, and she refused to let Kendall see her fail. But then something unexpected happened. Liam started making her feel safe. One evening they went to a small restaurant near their apartment, a hole-in-the-wall kind of place Liam loved because it wasn't filled with suits and empty conversations. Victoria played along, trying to convince herself that it was just another scene in her performance. Then halfway through dinner she heard them, a couple at a nearby table, whispering just loud enough for her to catch the words. She's slumming it. Look at her, Sinclair's daughter, eating in a dump like this. Probably some rebellious phase rich girls love pretending they're normal. Victoria felt her stomach tighten. She had heard things like this before, but this time it was different. This time she wasn't playing a role in her world, she was in Liam's. Liam must have noticed her tense posture, because he placed his hand over hers, grounding her. Ignore them, she forced a tight smile. I don't care. He saw right through her. Without hesitation Liam turned toward the couple, his expression calm but firm. You have something to say, or are you just hoping she fears you? The table fell silent. The couple looked away, embarrassed, pretending they hadn't been speaking at all. Victoria's pulse quickened. Nobody had ever defended her like that before, not in a way that wasn't self-serving, not in a way that actually made her feel protected. She wasn't sure if she was playing the game anymore or if she was being played. She got very anxious one night and didn't even realize she was pacing until Liam caught her wrist and softly pulled her to sit down on the couch. Hey, he asked, pulling her to the couch. What's wrong? She quickly shook her head. Nothing. Liam waited. He didn't press for an explanation like most people would have. He just sat there, patient and present. Victoria wanted to talk, which scared her, so she pulled her hand away and stood up. I need some air. Liam didn't say anything else. Stop her. He just watched her go. She barely had time to process her shifting emotions before her father blew everything up. Charles Sinclair was a man who controlled every aspect of his empire with a firm, unyielding grip, and Victoria, she had been raised to understand that her actions were a reflection of the Sinclair name. So when he finally learned about her marriage, he didn't react with disappointment. He reacted with pure, unfiltered rage. She came home to find him already inside her apartment, sitting in the one decent chair. They owned his presence, making the entire space feel even smaller. He stood as soon as she entered, his cold gaze locking onto her. Tell me it's a lie. Victoria didn't flinch, but her throat tightened. You married a janitor. His voice dripped with disgust. Liam walked in a second later, stopping short when he saw the older man. What the hell is this? Sinclair turned his glare toward Liam, looking at him like he was dirt under his shoe. This is you're ruining my daughter's life. Liam squared his shoulders. With all due respect, Sir Jor. Sinclair laughed and stepped forward. You think this is real? You think she actually wants this life? Victoria's stomach dropped. She hadn't told Liam the truth about why she married him. and now that her father was standing between them, she could feel the walls closing in. "Pack your things," Sinclair said in a sharp voice, "you're coming home." Victoria's mouth went dry. "No," Sinclair said, "if you don't end this fake marriage, you're done." Offers. Liam stiffened beside her. "You're giving her an ultimatum." Victoria's pulse raced. This wasn't part of the plan. She never expected to actually lose everything. Her father's voice cut through her thoughts. "Choose." Victoria turned to Liam, desperation clawing at her chest. "Maybe we should slow things down," she said quickly, trying to find a way out, trying to stall, trying to make everything stop unraveling. Liam's expression shifted instantly. Confusion. Curt realization. He studied her, waiting for her to take it back, but she didn't. Instead, she saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Absolute clarity. "You were never going to stay, were you?" His voice was quiet, but it carried enough weight to knock the air from her lungs. Victoria opened her mouth, but no words came out. She didn't know what to say. Liam let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his hair while he took a step back, then another. "I was right about you." Her father watched the scene unfold, his expression unreadable. Victoria swallowed hard. "Liam, I don't." He cut her off. His voice wasn't angry, it was worse. It was disappointed. Without another word, he walked out. Victoria stood frozen in the center of the room, watching the man who had once looked at her like she was everything walk away without looking back. Victoria sat on the edge of her father's office chair, gripping the armrests as if that could anchor her to the life she was about to lose. She had come here expecting to be scolded, not discarded. Charles Sinclair, ever the composed businessman, didn't raise his voice, didn't even look particularly angry. He looked disappointed. He said, looking through a stack of papers on his desk, "I thought you were smarter than this." Victoria's chest tightened. "It's over," she said quickly. "Liam's gone. I ended it. I'm back where I belong." Her father finally looked at her, and the moment their eyes met, she knew she wasn't going back anywhere. "You think it's that easy?" he asked. "You think you can ruin this family's name and walk back and like nothing happened?" Victoria's nails dug into the leather of the chair. "I made a mistake," she admitted, "but I fixed it." Charles leaned forward, clasping his hands on the desk. "No, Victoria, you lost." Her stomach dropped. "I tolerated your reckless behavior for years," he continued, his voice cold and sharp. "The drinking, the scandals, the entitlement. But this was a disgrace. You married a janitor, paraded your bad decisions in public, and now you expect me to clean up your mess." She opened her mouth, but he wasn't finished. "I don't want you back." Victoria froze. "I had your accounts locked this morning." Charles continued, flipping a page like he was discussing the weather. "Your penthouse is no longer yours. Any assets under my name are gone. You have nothing." Her throat went dry. "Dad, leave." She stared at him, waiting for him to change his mind, waiting for him to look at her and see his daughter, not a liability, but he didn't. When she didn't move, he pressed the intercom button on his desk. "Security escort Miss Sinclair out." Victoria felt her world tilt. She had never truly felt powerless before, not when her mother died, not when she walked, not even when her marriage to C fell apart because of her lies. But now that she was sitting across from her father, the man who had run every part of her life, she finally understood what it meant to be nothing. The doorman didn't stop her as she was led out of the Sinclair tower. He barely looked at her. It was as if her father had made her disappear as soon as he wanted to. By the time she got to her penthouse, the locks had already been changed, and she banged on the door, but no one answered. Concierge refused to meet her eyes. "I'm sorry, Miss Sinclair, but you're no longer a resident here." She felt sick. No money, no home, no allies. She pulled out her phone to call Kendall, then hesitated. No, she couldn't go to Kendall. Kendall would laugh. She tried calling the others, old friends, people she had once partied with, vacationed with, wasted time and money with. Not a single one answered. Her father had cut her off from everything. Victoria Sinclair, the woman who once had the world at her feet, had nowhere to go. She spent the next few nights couch surfing. A former acquaintance let her stay for exactly 2 nights before claiming she was expecting a long-term guest and that it was nothing personal. Victoria knew what that meant. She was dead weight now. She spent 1 night in a cheap motel using what little cash she had left, then realized something horrifying. She needed a job. The thought had never occurred to her before. Why would it work? Was something other people did. Now it was something she had to do to survive. It took 3 days before she Landed a job at a small cafe. The only place willing to take someone with no experience, no references, and an attitude that barely masked her panic. The first shift was a disaster. She burned her hand on the espresso machine, snapped at a customer who didn't deserve it, and nearly quit 3 times before the night was over. Her feet hurt, her back hurt, her pride hurt the most, and then, as if the universe hadn't humiliated her enough, it happened. She turned around and saw them, Kendall, her old circle, sitting at a corner booth watching her. For a brief moment they looked shocked. Then, as Victoria fumbled with a tray, almost dropping an entire order onto the floor, the laughter started, loud, unapologetic, cruel. She clenched her jaw, forcing herself not to react. One of them, Sabrina, maybe, waved her over mockingly. "Excuse me, miss," she called. "I think my latte is a little too bitter." The whole table laughed. Victoria's face burned, but she refused to give them the satisfaction. She turned on her heel and walked straight into the back room. She felt tears prick her eyes. She didn't know why she thought about him. Maybe it was because now she understood what it meant to struggle. Maybe it was because despite everything she had done, Liam had never laughed at her pain. She wasn't even sure why she searched for his name online, but when she saw the photos, her breath hitched. There he was, standing in front of a small storefront, shaking hands with another man. The caption beneath the article read, "Liam Carter, former janitor, opens local bookstore with community grad." He had moved on, not just from her, from all that Liam had built something. He was standing on his own, thriving. Victoria swallowed the lump in her throat that should have been her when instead she was staring at a screen, trying not to fall apart. She closed her laptop and exhaled slowly. There was no one left to save her, and she didn't know if she had it in her to save herself. The laughter from the cafe still echoed in Victoria's head as she pushed open the door to her shared apartment. She tossed her bag onto the tiny couch, ignoring the way her hands shook every ounce of humiliation from earlier still clung to her skin like a bad perfume. She had endured plenty of embarrassment over the past few months, but today had been different. It wasn't just about losing her wealth or her place in society. It was about how quickly people had turned on her, how eagerly they had waited for her to fail. A bitter thought crossed her mind. They never really liked me. They liked what I represented. Collapsing onto the bed, she exhaled sharply. There was nothing left to do but keep going. The job was grueling, the pay barely enough to scrape by, but at least she had something. She had earned something on her own. The brief sense of accomplishment shattered when her phone buzzed. She nearly ignored it, assuming it was another overdue bill notification, but the name on the screen sent a chill down her spine. Kendall Hastings. Her grip tightened around the device. The last time they had spoken, Kendall had been laughing over cocktails, proposing a bet that now felt like a lifetime ago. She let the phone ring twice before answering. "What do you want, Kendall's?" Victoria's jaw clenched as the phone rang. "Relax, Vic. I just wanted to check in on you." A short, happy laugh came through the receiver. "Fine. I was just wondering if Liam knows the truth yet." Kendall continued to pretend innocence. "It would be a shame if someone, oh, I don't know, told him what really happened," Victoria said. "Don't be too late," Kendall said in a mean voice. "He deserves to know, don't you think?" Victoria jumped out of bed and grabbed her jacket. She had to find Liam before Kendall did. Liam's bookstore was only a few blocks away, but the walk felt like it went on forever by the time Victoria reached the glass doors. Her chest was tight and her hands were numb. The bell above the entrance rang as she walked inside. The store was small but warm, with tall bookshelves and the smell of old pages in the air. Liam was talking to a customer behind the counter, but the moment his gaze landed on her, his expression darkened, her breath hitched. He knew Kendall had beaten her here. The customer took the receipt and left the door shutting behind them with a thud. Liam stepped around the counter, his eyes locked onto hers. His face was unreadable, calm, steady, but the way his jaw clenched, the way his hands curled into fists at his sides told her everything she needed to know. "How long?" His voice was quiet, controlled. Victoria swallowed hard. "Liam, how long was I a joke to you?" He demanded. The words hit harder than she expected. "I Never. She stopped shaking her head. Lying wouldn't fix this. It started as a bet, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, but Liam scoffed, stepping back a bet. She hated how the words sounded coming from him. It wasn't what you think, she said quickly. It was stupid, and you married me as a game. He cut her off. Tell me what I'm supposed to think. She reached for him instinctively, but he pulled back. It wasn't all a lie, she pleaded. I didn't expect to what he snapped. Fall for me, is that supposed to make it better? Her throat tightened. I was differ back then. Liam exhaled sharply, shaking his head. And now what? You expect me to believe you've changed? The reality of what she had done, of how deeply she had hurt him, crashed down on her all at once. She had spent so much time clawing her way back, trying to build herself into someone she could live with, but it didn't matter. Nothing she did would erase the past. Liam turned toward the register, grabbing a set of keys. We're done here, Liam. He didn't even look at her as he walked toward the door. Leave. She could have begged, could have tried to make him listen, but she didn't. Instead, she stepped back, letting the weight of her own choices settle fully onto her shoulders. As the door clicked shut behind her, she knew she had no one to blame but herself. Victoria didn't cry, she didn't fall apart, didn't spiral into the self-pity that once came so easily. Liam was gone, and she had no way to fix what she had broken, so she stopped trying. The next day she showed up to work early, tied her apron tight, and pushed forward. Every shift felt like another layer of her old self peeling away, leaving something rare, something real. She still passed by her old life from time to time, the clubs, the high-rise apartments, the expensive boutiques. She saw familiar faces, but none of them acknowledged her anymore. That was fine, she didn't need them. Her only goal now was survival. And then her father made his next move. Victoria scanned the article again, her stomach twisting tighter with every line. Liam Carter's bookstore was under investigation. Accusations of misused grants, financial fraud, and business malpractice had surfaced overnight. She knew exactly who was behind it. Her father had been waiting for the right moment to strike, and now, just as Liam had built something for himself, Charles Sinclair had destroyed it. Her fingers curled around the newspaper, knuckles turning white. This wasn't business, it was personal, and it was all because of her. The fallout was swift and brutal. Within hours, Liam's reputation was in shambles. The same news outlets that had praised his rise from a hotel janitor to a small business owner now painted him community betrayed, man with no business background secures grant money. Where did it go? Liam hadn't done anything wrong, but by the end of the week, the damage was already done. His landlord kicked him out, saying that the sudden media attention was unsafe for the building. Job offers dried up overnight, and the hotel where he had worked for years cut ties with him, saying they couldn't handle the bad press. He had worked hard for years to achieve success, but in a matter of days, Liam Carter, the man who had built his life from nothing, had nothing left. Victoria called Liam's number a third time that night, but the call went straight to voicemail. She clenched her teeth and sucked back her anger. She had to talk to him. He had to understand that this wasn't his fault. After another failed call, she battered her coat and went to his apartment, but when she got there, it was empty. The landlord had already locked the door. In the hallway, staring at the vacant space, her chest tightening, she was too late. She had no idea where he had gone, but she knew someone who might have took 3 more calls and a reluctant favor from an old connection before she found out where Liam had been staying, a rundown motel on the outskirts of the city. When she pulled into the parking lot, the neon sign buzzed weakly above her, casting the cracked pavement in a dim red glow. Room 14. She hesitated outside the door, pressing her lips together before knocking. Twice silence, then the lock turned. Liam stood in the doorway, the dim light behind him casting shadows over his tired face. He looked drained emotionally and physically. His hair was unkempt, his shirt wrinkled as if he hadn't cared enough to change in days. Victoria felt the full weight of what her world had done to him. He exhaled sharply, eyes flicking over her before he stepped back. You shouldn't be here. She ignored that. Liam, I didn't what? His voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it. Didn't know what your father was capable of. Her Throat tightened. I didn't think he would do this. Liam let out a bitter chuckle. Then you don't know your own family. She took a step forward, gripping the doorframe. I can fix this. That made him pause. Then he looked at her like she had just told a cruel joke. Fix it. He shook his head. You don't get it, do you? Victoria opened her mouth, but he cut her off. This isn't your world, Sinclair. When people like me fall, we don't get back up. We don't have safety nets. No second chances. He gestured around the room. Frustration bleeding through his exhaustion. This is what happens when someone like me crosses into your world. It chews us up and spits us out. She shook her head. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Liam scoffed. Yeah, well, it is. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then he stepped back, hand on the door. Go home, Victoria. Her stomach dropped. Liam, but he was already shutting the door. She didn't fight it. The lock clicked, sealing her out. Victoria stood there for a long moment, staring at the faded wood of the door. She had spent her entire life believing she could talk her way out of anything, that no mistake was ever truly permanent, that everything could be repaired. This time she wasn't so sure. She turned and walked away, leaving the motel behind. Victoria sat in the corner booth of the cafe, staring at the cold cup of coffee in front of her. The place was nearly empty. The late hour thinning out the usual crowd. The hum of the espresso machine and the occasional class of dishes were the only sounds breaking the silence. Liam's words from the motel still echoed in her head. Go home, Victoria, except she didn't have a home to go back to. She had spent weeks trying to rebuild something herself, her life, maybe even Liam's trust, but none of it mattered because her father wouldn't stop. He had crushed Liam with a single move, reducing him to nothing, just as he had done to her, and now Victoria saw what she should have realized all along. If she didn't fight back, he wouldn't stop until Liam was ruined beyond repair. She reached into her bag, pulling out her phone. The news articles were still circulating, twisting the story further. She tightened her grip on the device. For so long, she had lived in her father's shatter and been a part of the machine that crushed people like Liam. Now she had to make a choice. She took a deep breath and typed out a message to 2 news network contacts with the subject line, "Statement on Liam Carter and Sinclair Enterprises." The next morning, her father's name was all over the news. Victoria hadn't just given a statement, she gave them everything. She stood in front of flashing cameras and reporters shouting over one another, but her voice was steady. The accusations against Liam Carter are completely false. My father, Charles Sinclair, orchestrated a smear campaign to destroy his reputation. Why? Because Liam had the audacity to exist outside of his control. The reporters ate up their questions rapid fire. Are you saying Sinclair Enterprises deliberately fabricated evidence? Yes, she answered without hesitation, and this isn't the first time. A gasp purpled to the CR crowd. The daughter of Charles Sinclair was turning against him. She went on, I spent my life watching my father manipulate and destroy people who didn't fit into his perfect world. She was a part of it, but not anymore. It was reckless, it was dangerous, and for the first time, it was her choice. Sinclair fought back almost right away. Victoria wasn't naive enough to think he'd just stand there and let his empire take a hit without fighting back. The attack came quickly and hit her where it hurt the most, her bank account. The small savings she had saved were suddenly frozen while an investigation was going on, and her name was dragged through the mud. Through the media, labeled a bitter, disgraced Aries, desperate for attention, and worst of all, the few people who had still tolerated her presence banished. Kendall's text came first. Good luck with your charity case. You're officially irrelevant. Then the others followed, cold, detached responses from people she had once called friends, now eager to distance themselves from her fallout. Victoria sat in her rented room, phone in hand, watching her world shrink even further. She was truly alone. Her shift at the cafe ran late. That night, dinner had left her tired and her hands hurt from washing dishes, but she was glad to have the work to do. The walk back to her apartment was peaceful, with dimly lit streets and the city's unique, unpredictable nighttime vibe. She was halfway down an alley when she heard footsteps. At first, she thought it was just her paranoia, but then she heard the queer sound of a shoe scuffing against the pavement behind her, letting her know she wasn't alone. Victoria sped up her pace. But before she could make it out to the main road, two men stepped into her path. She stopped cold. They weren't just random thugs, their stats, the way they carried themselves. This was planned. One of them smirked. You shouldn't run your mouth, Sinclair. Her pulse pounded. This wasn't a robbery, this was a message. She took a cautious step back, but the second man shifted, cutting off her escape. Panic set in, then a voice rang out behind them. I'd rethink that if I were you. The man froze. Victoria's heart nearly stopped. Liam stepped forward, his presence calm but undeniably dangerous. He fixed his eyes on the men and couldn't read them, but there was something in the look that sent a clear warning. There was a silent standoff between them, and then the two men backed off, disappearing into the shadows. Victoria let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, and Liam watched them leave before turning to her. She nodded, even though her legs were still shaking, and he looked at her as if to see if she was lying. Glowed to mock her, to tell her she had finally pushed too far, but he didn't. He just stood there, arms crossed, watching her. For the first time in months, they weren't enemies, they weren't anything, just two people standing in the same storm. Liam exhaled, shaking his head. Where are you staying? Victoria hesitated. She didn't have an answer. Liam didn't react. He didn't offer her a place to stay, didn't give her words of comfort. Instead, he turned and walked away. Victoria never expected a single moment of clarity to change her entire life, but the night in the alley changed her. She had spent months trying to make things right with Liam, undoing the past, and getting back something that was never hers in the first place. But Liam didn't need apologies, he needed proof. This time, she stopped chasing him and focused on herself. Her old life had been a bunch of lies, and she was done living in them. One day, while she was cleaning tables at the cafe, she heard someone talking about a local charity event where a shelter for displaced families was being built. Victoria remembered a conversation she had with Liam about helping people who had nothing, and she signed up the next day. At first, she wasn't sure why she did it. Maybe it was out of guilt, maybe she wanted to see what real struggle was like. But as the weeks went by, she helped stock food banks, sort clothing donations, and listened to families who had lost everything just as quickly as she had. That's when she realized for the first time what she was doing. Something that had nothing to do with herself. There was no audience, no ulterior motive, just genuine work. And somewhere along the way, Liam noticed Liam hadn't left the city, but he might as well have disappeared after the bookstore shut down. He spent weeks bouncing between temporary jobs, anything that paid, under the table construction sites, overnight shifts at warehouse fixing busted plumbing in cheap apartment complexes, the kind of work where nobody asked questions and nobody cared. For a while, he slept on a friend's couch. When that favor ran out, he found a room in a rundown apartment building on the edge of town, the kind with flickering hallway lights and a landlord who only showed up for rent. His hands went steady from carefully shelving books were now covered in calluses, his back ached from lifting crud, and yet it was still better than being someone's charity case. The only reason he stuck around was because leaving would have meant Sinclair won, so he stayed. He survived, and he made sure no one, not Sinclair, not Victoria, would ever get the chance to knock him down again. Liam never expected Victoria Sinclair to stay down. When she lost her wealth, he assumed she'd crawl back to the life she knew, find another way to manipulate her way into comfort. But she hadn't. Instead, she had disappeared from high society entirely. No more headlines, no more public outbursts. He saw her at the cafe sometimes. She looked different now, tired but steady. She didn't fake a smile when she served customers, didn't put on an act for anyone. She just worked. And then he heard about the shelter. At first, he didn't believe it. Victoria Sinclair volunteering, but then he saw it for himself. No cameras, no reporters, no audience, just Victoria helping people the way he once dreamed of doing. She wasn't doing it for attention, she wasn't doing it for him, she was doing it because something inside her had changed. He wasn't sure what to think. The night he finally approached her, the air was crisp, the city streets quieter than usual. Victoria was locking up the cafe when she heard the familiar voice behind her. You don't give up, do you? She turned. Startled. Liam stood a few feet. Victoria swallowed and said, I stopped trying to chase you. There was a long pause between them, and then Liam took a slow breath and said, I don't need grand gestures. I just need to know, was any of it real? Victoria's chest tightened. She had spent so long avoiding that question, pretending the truth didn't matter, but now it did. It wasn't real. At first, she admitted it, her voice steady. I was selfish, reckless, and I treated you like a dame. Liam didn't move, didn't react. She forced herself to hold his gaze. No more lies, no more performances. But I fell in love with you anyway. Liam studied her for so long. All he had seen when he looked at her was deception. Now, for the first time, he saw something else. Regret, honesty, change. He didn't say anything right away, but he didn't walk away either. Victoria stood outside the towering glass building, staring up at the legacy that no longer belonged to her. For so long, this place had been her entire world. The polished floors, the high-stakes meetings, the power woven into every deal her father made. She had spent years believing she was destined to inherit all of it. Now she wasn't sure why she had come at all. She should have ignored the call, let it go unanswered like she had every other time her father reached out since she exposed him. But something inside her, some old broken piece of her that still craved his approval, had brought her here. Squaring her shoulders, she stepped through the revolving doors. Whatever he wanted, this would be the last time she listened. Her father was waiting in his office, seated behind the massive mahogany desk that had once felt so untouchable, but he didn't look untouchable now. The man who had built empires with his bare hands, who had ruled over their world like a king, now sat with his elbows on the desk, his fingers steepled, his jaw tight. Sinclair Enterprises had been bleeding since the scandal broke. Stockholders were pulling out, partners were distancing themselves, and for the first time in decades, Charles Sinclair was losing. Victoria didn't say a word as she entered, neither did he. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the faint hum of the city beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. Then finally he leaned back in his chair and smiled. You've made a mess, he said, his voice smooth, controlled, but we can fix it. Victoria didn't flinch. There's nothing to fix, her father exhaled, shaking his head like she was a child who didn't understand the weight of her actions. You're my daughter, Victoria. That name still means something. She crossed her arms. Not to me. A flicker of something cold passed through his eyes, but his expression remained composed. I built this empire for you, and despite everything you've done, I'm willing to let you come back to take your place again. Victoria didn't move. She already knew where this was going. He continued, as if he hadn't noticed her silence. Your image has been damaged, but that can be repaired. You'll have everything back, your fortune, your place in society, the life you were meant for. His gaze darkened slightly. But there's one condition. She waited. You'll cut ties. The words hit her like a slap. Her father had been carefully watching her, waiting for her to break, so the old version of her could crawl back, desperate to regain her status. She didn't. Victoria could have laughed at the irony. A year ago, she would have said yes without hesitation. She would have chosen power over people, comfort over chaos. But now that she was hearing the same manipulative tone her father had always used to get her to do what he wanted, she realized something. She wasn't that girl anymore. Lived that life she had been worshipped for, her last name, surrounded by wealth and power, playing in a world where nothing was real, and she had been miserable. She thought of Liam, the way he had looked at her when he finally started to believe she had changed, the way he had fought for his future, only to have it ripped away by the man sitting in front of her. Her father was still waiting, still watching, so sure she would crumble. She met his gaze, her voice steady. I'd rather have nothing with him than everything with you. Silence. Her father's expression didn't change, but she saw the shift in his eyes. For the first time he knew he had lost. Victoria turned and walked out of his office. She didn't look back. Victoria stood in her tiny apartment, staring out at the city lights flickering through the window. It wasn't much, but it was hers. No more penthouses, no more staff catering to her every whim, just a small imperfect space filled with a kind of quiet she never knew she needed. The past year had reshaped her completely, the girl who once played with people's lives. Victoria was thinking about something when the doorbell rang. She wasn't expecting anyone to be there, and her heart raced as she crossed the room to open it. Liam stood on the other side of the door, his face blank, his hands in the pockets of his jacket, but he slowly pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. Victoria recognized it right away, their old marriage certificate. Liam let out a sigh and held it out in front of him. Married me for a bet, he said, his voice steady now. Mar me for real. Victoria didn't speak right away. 1,000 emotions crashed over her: shock, disbelief, hope. But one thing was clear: Liam wasn't testing her. He wasn't giving her an ultimatum. He was giving her a choice. She had spent her entire life chasing the wrong things: money, power, validation. But standing here looking at the man she had once tricked into loving her, she finally understood she didn't need any of it. She just needed him. She took the paper from his hand, but this time she didn't hesitate. Yes, Liam let out a quiet breath, almost like he hadn't been sure what she would say, but then a slow, genuine smile broke across his face, and that was it. No grand gestures, no dramatic declarations, just a promise, simple and real. They kept it small: no lavish venues, no celebrity guest lists, no overpriced designer band, just close friends, quiet vows, and a love that didn't need to be put on display. Victoria wore a dress she bought herself, not because it was expensive or exclusive, but because it felt like her. Instead of walking down the aisle under chandeliers or posing for magazine covers or social media headlines, she stood next to Liam with their hands entwined and their hearts steady. For the first time, she wasn't performing or winning a bet. She was choosing a life she hadn't even known she wanted. After the ceremony, they sat in their tiny apartment, just the two of them, with no flashing cameras or happy headlines. Victoria curled up against Liam's side, their fingers laced together. For so long, she had fought for this moment. Power, for status, for a life that had been nothing but a hollow dream. Now she had something real, and this time she knew she would never let it go. She didn't just win a bet, she won the life she never knew she needed. In the weeks that followed, they worked together to reopen Liam's bookstore. The space wasn't glamorous, just a small shop on a quiet corner with creaky wooden shelves and mismatched chairs for readers to linger in, but it was theirs. Victoria poured herself into the work, learning how to handle inventory, chat with customers, and even host book clubs. Liam, ever patient, taught her the ins and outs of running a business. The store became a reflection of their journey: simple, honest, and built with care. Customers slowly trickled back, and drawn not just by the books but by the warmth the couple brought to the place. Victoria's sharp wit softened into charm, and Liam's steady presence made every visitor feel at home. At the end of each day, they'd lock up together, the hum of the city quieting as they walked hand in hand back to their apartment. The business wasn't booming, but it didn't need to be. It was enough, because this time they weren't building for show, they were building a life together. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed this story, give this video a like if you haven't already, and subscribe for more.